If I could reassure you, Councillor Slack, we're trying to do this under the same umbrella as our existing council housing programme, and in that commitment we've made, we were trying to achieve an EPC-B on all retrofit properties, and we've managed to do that so far. There is an element of the grant that does pay for renovation costs as well as our costs in the acquisition process. So, yeah, none of us would want to put a family into a property that wasn't fit and with risks attached to it. So we're obviously mindful as a small landlord. We're trying to do the best we can with each property we have, and you can have my assurance we won't be doing that. Yeah.
Councillor Flitter.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I've read this report with interest, and in great detail. I've made lots of circles and underlined lots here, but I'm not going to ask all those questions tonight. But I just want to concentrate. I'm just not too sure on the memorandum of understanding, which is that binding document, but I don't know exactly what restrictions, conditions, or whether the risks have actually been assessed by a risk assessment. And if there's any information on that, I'd appreciate it. Also, we're told that one of the financial risks is high. Have we done an assessment, a risk assessment on that? And what mitigation circumstances have we got in place to manage that risk? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Flitter. Yes, I think the nature of the prospectus that the government issued, it's only 20 pages long. If it was a Homes England grant, we'd be knee-deep in paperwork before we got anywhere near spending any money. So it reflects the pressure in the system, and the webinars I've been going to with the other councils that have, I can say, benefited from this grant, but have been awarded this grant. The application process is quite slim. It was literally 5 yes or no answers. So the government are under a lot of pressure to deliver. They see us as a key part of that delivery mechanism. In the appendix, there is a risk assessment at the end of the report, which sets out some of the key issues I felt could come to pass in terms of delays in acquisition, etc. The choice that some people might express when they're looking to take up one of the properties we've secured through this. And some of that's been addressed in the webinars that we've attended. I'm sure Karen will want to talk on the financial risk assessment in a moment. I think the MOU itself as well would obviously be signed off by James as Corporate Services Director. But in all of that, we've been very clear that if we can't deliver, we're not going to be penalised for handing money back, and that will simply be recycled to another area where the market's different and they'll be able to deliver. Karen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Rob. I assessed the financial risk as high because I was concerned about the availability of properties within the levels of funding that's allowed. But Rob gave me a reassurance, and it's in the prospectus, that if we don't identify the numbers of properties that are in the proposal, then we can simply give back that element of the grant funding.
Thank you, Chair, for that, because that's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Thank you. Councillor Burford.
Chair, I think my question's been answered. Actually, it's about the funding limit of £215,000. Is that allocated to each district housing authority individually? So it's varied throughout the country, presumably. Yeah.
Yeah. So the low quartile price will be different in every council. So a London Borough would have a much higher grant rate than Derbyshire. Well, not that much higher, but Bolsover haven't got a grant, but you know what I mean. That kind of area would get a different grant rate.
Thank you. Councillor Gamble, question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and yes, Karen's concern would have been exactly mine, so it's good to hear that answer. It's just a little question on 7.8, because it mentions here that acquisition, renovation and allocations work will be undertaken by Nottingham Community Housing Association. What's the exact nature of the relationship there will they just be doing that? Will they be funded separately, or do we pay Nottingham Housing Association to do work for us? What's the relationship there?
Good question. So this is being delivered under the auspices of the Council Housing Programme. So I think I've set out in the report that NCHA are our development agent. We have a contract with them, 20-year contract renewed every 5 years. That's come before council and members have approved that as the Council Housing Programme. So we're not, although we're very good at housing, Simon and I, we're not buyers and sellers and managers of day-to-day housing. So NCHA own 10,000 homes. Adding a small contract like ours up to 50 units is no mean feat for them. So they do the heavy lifting in terms of the skills you need to buy, manage and renovate property.
So yeah, so will it actually be Nottingham Housing Association buying these houses, and will essentially be a sort of funnel for the money, or? No,
that is one way of doing it, but as I've said in the report, most of the large associations are on with delivering their programme. So this is very much money to the council that we will be adding our grant to in order to buy a property for us, for the council, and that will be ours for the longer term. The property will then be managed and maintained by the Housing Association. The £20,000 grant we get alongside each acquisition covers our costs for the legal and development fees that NCHA and their legal partner charge, and which is standard in development practice. In collecting the rent for us and paying us the rent, we then pay them back a proportion of that as a management fee, which is standard.
I think that sort of answers my other question. Actually, I was sort of wondering, because obviously these houses have been sort of brought up through this scheme, and I was sort of wondering where they'll ultimately end up. So, but they will actually ultimately end up in the ownership of Nottingham Housing Association. No. Oh, sorry, they'll end up in the scheme where we sort of own them, but Nottingham Housing Association manage them for us. That's what they'll end up into. Okay, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Hobson, question?
Thank you, Chair. I think it's partly been answered. Obviously, we have got quite a lot of demand on this service with local people at risk of homelessness and whatever. So, all credit to you for working so hard with that. And obviously, this problem isn't going to go away, and you're looking at, at recommendation 4, delivering wider refugee support where opportunities allow. So I think my question's been answered, but can I just say on a personal level, both Rob and Simon have been helpful to me with specific questions from refugee families in my own area. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Councillor Buttle.
And my question has also been answered. I was going to ask whether or not this was going to end up as part of our stock, and clearly it is, and because our Section 106 unit money is going into it, that's as it should be. And altogether an excellent scheme, and I really love the EPCB. That means we're also going to be cutting down on fuel poverty. So all in all, it's a really good result, and thank you, Rob.
Councillor Purdy, was there another question?
If I may, very quickly, Chair, to what Rob said earlier on, are we confined to finding properties in our own district? Is there any, I mean, we look at the prices in Derbyshire Dales compared to the Valley, you're going to get more for your buck. And on recommendation 3, if you remember, I asked a pre-brief question. I'm happy to give delegated authority as a vote, but I think there was a figure mentioned of the risk between 3,000 and 30,000. I think just so members are aware what that risk is. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Purdy. The prospectus doesn't preclude and encourages councils to work together. So some councils are working collaboratively where they've got a pooled allocation, perhaps across areas. We can buy properties in neighbouring authorities. As a small landlord, we wouldn't normally do that, but we would have to work with that neighbouring authority and get their approval. I'm sure Derby City may be unwilling to, given their own pressures, to help. But if we were struggling, I think we could keep that open. In relation to recommendation 3, actually I think it was recommendation 5 in the report. At the same time that the £500 million grant was announced, the government announced a £150 million revenue grant to councils. Now, the details of that haven't been announced yet. And as Simon said in the pre-briefing, we could get £3,000, we could get £30,000, we just don't know. It depends on how the government decide to distribute that money. But in any event, in order to, and I think I've explained already the sort of pressure in the system, I'd like delegated authority to spend that grant when it comes in, and rather than come back with another report, which might take 4 or 5 months to get in front of you, and then incur further delay in trying to relieve some of the pressures that we've been facing. So hopefully members will bear with me on that, and we can report retrospectively and go through any urgent decision making that we have to. But that's the purpose of recommendation 5. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Archer, I'm coming back to you, as your first comment was of making it upon what Rob has just said as regards making note that his wishes to have delegated powers on that item if there is more funding rather than having to come back. So can we make that clear to everybody in the room? Thank you.
Would you like me to move it? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I will be really happy to move this. I just want to say a big thank you to Rob and his team. Really, I read this report with interest in it. It's an exceptionally good report on an exceptionally complicated and incredibly important matter to sort of try and give us a clear indication of what we can do, and also for his explanations tonight as well, which I think have really helped. Just to put a bit of perspective on it, in terms of making this real, we hosted my own family hosted 2 Ukrainians. My sister-in-law's family have hosted a family of Ukrainians, and my next door neighbour is very actively involved in the Ashbourne community refugee group. So I met and had a chat with them a couple of weeks ago, and it's really heartwarming actually to see the response of the Derbyshire Dales community to these issues. The world is in a mess through no fault of the Derbyshire Dales, and it's been a challenge to host Ukrainian refugees for many people. And I know other people, we've been very fortunate. Our Ukrainian refugees, even though they didn't have any English when they arrived, got a job, got into college, are now contributing to the local economy. We've managed to find them their own accommodation, and they're all set up. A lot of the Ukrainians, when they first came over, I think hoped very much the war maybe wouldn't last that long and intended to return. But I think, as we can all see from the news, the war is likely to go on. And I think many more of the Ukrainian refugees are now going to be able to see staying in the UK as a long-term solution. That certainly was the case with our family and with the family that my sister-in-law also hosted. So the pressure is certainly there. And a big barrier that we found in trying to find them accommodation, even though they had a job and they could afford rent, was the guarantor for the rent, with them not having credit history. In the end, we as hosts had to agree to be guarantors, which we were fortunate to be in a position to do. So anything that can be done on that would be, I think, a massive help to hosts who are trying to help their families get into rental accommodation. So I think that's excellent to see that's being thought through, because that will make a massive difference to help people get from host homes into their own homes and get their own lives set up and going. So I think that's excellent, and I want to emphasise the point here really that even though we're talking about money coming from government, we should not see refugees as a burden. We shouldn't see refugees as drains on our resources. They actually are people who want to come over and make a better life for themselves by working and getting involved in the local community, contributing, paying taxes, and that's certainly been an experience of what I've had personally with the Ukrainian refugees that we work with. I'm sure it would be with the Afghan refugees that the Ashbourne Community Refugee Group want to work with. And I want to pass on their thanks to you, Rob, as well, because I know they've mentioned to me how fantastically helpful and supportive you've been to them as a group in trying to help get a house in Ashbourne for and I think it's the bridge part of the bridging element of this for an Afghan family. So for me, it's a no-brainer. I know it's incredibly challenging. It's a challenging situation we've been left with through no fault of our own, but the Derbyshire Dales community deserves a huge amount of credit for the way it's responded to it, and the council through this report are clearly doing everything they can to support the ongoing challenges of the refugees coming into the area, which I honestly believe in the long term will be a great benefit and a great addition to our community, both in terms of them themselves coming and working and getting involved and contributing positively, but also actually it might be an added benefit for us in the long term of increased housing stock as well, and in the long term we might benefit from that for local people in housing need too. So I just think it's got lots and lots of really good positive elements to this. So I 100% support it and very happy to move it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Does that find a seconder? Councillor Slack.
Yes, I agree with everything Robert said. We are a humane society and we should do everything we possibly can to help people in the desperate states. Straight to the end. The country's been torn to pieces. It's many homes, as I've said previously, they'll never go back to lots of parts of Ukraine. They've flattened the Ukraine. It's been terrible for them. And these people come over here and they wanted to work. They wanted to really get working, same as the resident in my village who's got leave for the family. They really want to get a job and work and really want to learn English. And we've got to do everything we possibly can to help these people. So I fully support Robin and Simon in everything they do. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Councillor Allison.
Thank you, Chair. It's just great to hear the kind of personal experiences that people have had with Ukrainian refugees and how they can support them in the communities. I just want to make one point. I'm not going to vote against this, but I am concerned that this is a national policy. And if it's a national policy, it should be funded by central government. And they shouldn't be trying to get local funds to support their programme of rehousing. So I'm not going to vote against it, but I do have concerns that actually if the government are introducing these kinds of schemes, they should have a long-term plan, because we all know the Ukrainian war is probably going to go on for years. It doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, despite all the new tanks and everything that they're being sent at the moment. So that was the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Burford.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I don't want to repeat what others have said, particularly my colleague, Councillor Archer, an excellent speech just now. But I'd like to echo thanks to Robin and Simon for this excellent report. Very educational, in fact, not just informative, but educational. I think we learned a lot from it, but it's extremely complex, as others have said. But I did want to welcome the appointment of an officer to oversee the Homes for Ukraine scheme. That is an excellent initiative, I think, and obviously it will ease the workload of Robin and Simon and their colleagues in overseeing this problem. As others have said, it's going to go on and on. It's not going to be a short-term issue. I was intrigued about the use of Serco as a appointed contractor to find housing for asylum seekers. I assume that, I suppose it's a slight question away, I assume they're working to very high standards. They won't be taking or acquiring properties that have got, as Councillor Slack said, mould or damp problems, etc. They are regulated, presumably.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
I understand where you're coming from, so I'm sorry, we're in debate on that one, so our question can't be answered. Possibly privately later on. Thank you. Councillor Purdy.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I wasn't going to mention Serco. I've had enough conversation with Rob on that one. Chair, it is heartwarming to hear from Councillor Archer. Obviously, when you have personal impressions like that, it's very moving. But I think we're all moved by not just the Ukrainian situation, but we had the Afghans before, we had the Syrians before that. And the world is in turmoil, and it's very sad. You know, they said that the Second World War was the war to end all wars. It doesn't seem like that. We gave, a minute silent, I think it was, at one meeting some months ago. We put the Ukrainian flag up. Government are putting money in. They've increased the monies to the housing people that are looking after the Ukrainians. So well done, well said, Robert.
Councillor Statham.
Thank you, Chair. While I do support Ukraine and what's going off at the moment, I do feel sorry for our local young people, the first-time buyers. The council snapping up all the cheaper housing out there. The young ones are finding it quite hard out there to get a foot on the ladder, and with the council trying to grab the homes as well, I'm quite sorry for them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there anybody else who wishes to make a comment? Then I'd like to go to the vote. All those in favour, please show. And against? Abstentions? That's carried, thank you. Item 15, rural area designation. Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Before I sort of introduce the report, can I just clarify the recommendation 2? I've just picked it up as I've been going through the report. It says, as set out in paragraph 2.7 of the report. It should say paragraph 2.8 of the report. So if you could make a note of that for the resolution going forward. Chair, this report has its origins with the introduction of the First Homes initiative by the government last year. And this was debated at Council last January, where a resolution was made to seek a application to the Secretary of State for rural area designation for those qualifying parish council areas outside of the main sort of built-up areas of the district, and that being those parishes outside of Matlock, Ashbourne and Wirksworth within the local planning authority area. We made an application, as the report says, in May. Included within that report, members will be glad to know, was Tansley and Northwood and Tingersley. It took quite a while for the government to consider our application, but finally the statutory instrument was approved. It was laid before Parliament in November and came into force in December of last year. Chair, what the rural area designation does is have 3 implications for the District Council, 2 of which do not really need a resolution from Council, and the third one does, and that's the focus of this report. The first implication is that it allows us to have and put in place some safeguards from right to buy. And if there's any questions on that, then Rob will answer those. The second one is bullet point 3 in the report, and effectively what that does is take away the ability of developers to come forward and identify sites specifically for first homes exception sites. And that particular route would have, if it wasn't closed off by this designation, would have allowed developers to come in and say, we want to build in this particular location, we want to build them as first homes. And from members' recollection, if members can recall, first homes aren't necessarily the sort of right tenure of affordable homes that satisfies our needs for within the local community. So by closing that particular avenue off, it means that we can still continue on with the ability to deliver affordable homes as rural exception sites in the normal way. The third aspect of the rural area designation, and essentially the primary reason for bringing the report tonight, is that it allows us as a planning authority the ability to reduce the threshold for us to start and enter into negotiations with developers on sites from the nationally prescribed threshold of 10 dwellings down to a number of essentially down to 5 or even in some instances fewer. But the recommendation we're making for you tonight is that we revise the policy within the local plan, policy HC4, down from the threshold that's in that current policy when it was adopted in 2017, down to 5 units. Now, it's not without its risks, members, and the reason I say it's not without its risk is because the way in which the the National Planning Policy Framework is written, it suggests that the introduction of reduced thresholds should come through the introduction of new policy within the local plan. But as members will know, we're working on a review of that local plan. That the adoption of that new policy with a reduced threshold could be up to 2 years away. The timetable that members have agreed for the review of the local plan would see the adoption of a revised local plan not coming into force until the back end of 2024. So what we'd end up with a situation is essentially for over the period of the next 2 years, having a tool in place, this rural areas designation, not actually being able to use it. So what we've recommended to you is that this would be an interim measure that we would introduce with immediate effect, and that would then allow Chris Whitmore and his development management team, where qualifying applications come in, to seek to negotiate affordable homes on smaller sites than we currently have. The risk is that because of the way in which the NPPF is set itself out, there could be some challenges to it. But having weighed up the advantages and the disadvantages of waiting 2 years as against actually having the opportunities to deliver potentially more affordable housing over the next 2 years, it's felt that the benefits in this particular instance outweigh those particular risks. So that's why we're bringing the report forward for you this evening, Chair.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that the threshold is, or the provision is 30%. The goal is 30% of net dwellings. Mike, can you recall any developments in the last, since 2019, when we've actually met that 30% threshold? As far as I can see, the ones I can recall are no more than about 15%. I'm wondering, therefore, whether this is practical, and whether it actually is, we should be reviewing the actual obligation placed on. Also, the other issue is that at 5 houses, there won't be the scale economies that would be obtained from, say, 100 houses, and therefore it would be, the cost per house is likely to be greater. And I'm wondering whether this is, in fact, a tax on the small local developers and against national, which would reduce their ability to compete for sites against the national firms. So I'm a bit concerned by this on those 2 counts. Thank you.
Sure. In terms of the 30% requirement, that's a requirement that has been included within the local plan since 2017. That was subject to a viability assessment as part of the plan as a whole. And members that have been on council for a number of years will recall that the previous local plan had a provision that sought to try and achieve 45%. But in order to make sure that development continued to be viable and continued to be delivered, which is essentially what we've got to do, we had to vary the requirement down from 45% to 30%. The opportunity to vary that figure is not part of this report. That's something that we will need to consider as part of the ongoing review of the local plan, and that will be subject to, again, further viability testing as part of the work we do on assessing the deliverability of the local plan going forward. In terms of your question about the requirements or about whether or not it's been achieved, I haven't got that information immediately to hand. What I will say is that I know that in every single instance that we get an application that is a qualifying application, whether that be 10 units or more or 5 units or more in the future, the starting point for us will be always to seek to achieve 30%. It's not always feasible to deliver 30% on site. It's not always necessary or appropriate to deliver 30% on site, and Rob will probably give you, if you wanted to, chapter and verse on the reasons why that is the case. If the situation arises that, you know, we can't necessarily achieve 30% on site for viability reasons, or we feel that it's not appropriate to do so, then what we normally tend to do, as you'll know, is we'll try and seek to ensure that that 30% is delivered, but it may well be delivered by way of a financial contribution in which we, if you like, add to what's delivered on site. So we then achieve that, whilst we may not achieve it on site, overall, with the financial contribution, the ability to invest in affordable housing going forward, we can do that in the future.
And regarding the economies of scale on these small sites?
I think what this does is it will allow us the opportunity to have the negotiations for more affordable homes than we would be under a higher threshold. If a developer considers that it's going to have an impact on viability, then he will be able to, or they will be able to have an opportunity to submit a viability assessment and a feasibility assessment to us, which we will look at as we would do in the current circumstances.
Thank you. Councillor Purdy, question?
Yeah, question, Chair. Just preface it by the fact that Paul and I had a meeting with the new Chief Exec of Peak Park and the Chair on 3rd of January about housing issues there. So I know wards affected all outside of the Peak District National Park. Should it apply to the Peak Park, Mike, or not?
It already does, Councillor Purdy. Yeah, the Section 157 of the Housing Act effectively puts a blanket over national parks and outstanding areas of outstanding natural beauty. So they're already covered. We haven't been covered, and now we are covered.
Councillor Flitter, question?
Yeah, I wasn't going to speak on this one, but I mean, something I've always been concerned about is, I want to ask this question a different way than Councillor Hughes did, because I am concerned about the loss of affordable homes in Matlock. And I feel that where there have been lots of development without or with this financial contribution to build and suffice elsewhere. And I'm wondering how strong the appraisal for justifying this financial contribution is. And so the question would be, have we ever challenged one of these appraisals, and have we ever won one of these proposals? Because it seems to me that we've not been very successful in this area. You see, the thing that worries me as well, we talk about either 5 or 10 houses. There are small plots about, and developers, perhaps not national developers, but individuals have seen a way through that if they can get 5, 10 houses on a site, they'll apply on part of that site for one house, and it doesn't include any. So in total, over a matter of years, we'll get 10 houses on site and no contribution to affordable housing. So this instance about how we challenge those appraisals is very significant, and how strong are we in that defence?
Chair, I can't speak for Chris Whitmore and his team who would deal with those particular situations, but I know that, you know, in some instances we do challenge the financial appraisals that have been submitted, and indeed those members of planning committee will be aware that in some instances we have sought valuation office advice and independent advice to try and assess the financial appraisals which are submitted by the developers to determine to what extent the contents of those financial appraisals are valid, and the extent to which the assumptions are being made about costs and values on those individual sites are appropriate. And I know that, and I can't quote one off the top of my head, Councillor Flitter, but I know that there are instances where we have gone back to developers and we've said, we don't agree with what you've got. And we have had situations where that has led to our consideration of recommendations, whereby in terms of their ability of the developers to meet their requirements in terms of the affordable housing policy have had a detrimental impact upon the recommendations. In other words, we've been factoring in the fact that they've not been able to achieve their policy requirements, and therefore that's been a significant consideration in those decisions. But I can't put my hand up and say which one of those exactly, and I know there might be members around the table that can actually help me out on that in terms of which applications where we've done it, but we certainly have challenged them, and we've gone back and pushed back on a number of occasions on that. In terms of your point about site size, again, we have had applications in the past where we know that the developers have come in with schemes that have been below the threshold, and we've had applications for 9 units or more in the past, or sorry, for 9 units or less, where if we look, even when we've looked at the ability of those sites to accommodate development at a more appropriate density, they would have gone over that threshold, and they've deliberately come in. So, you know, there have been circumstances where that has happened, and again, we have pushed back on those applicants where we think it's inappropriate for us to do so, where we feel that the development potential of those sites should actually be greater.
Councillor Salt.
Thank you. Just a point of clarification around the implementation, really. Have I got it right that it might be 2 years before we can insist on this, but we've nothing to lose in the interim by implementing it, so we can start and have those conversations between now and then?
Yeah, essentially, this is an interim position that we're looking at. The guidance, the actual MPPF is a bit strangely worded, and it suggests you could actually go down as low as 1. But I think in terms of being reasonable, 5 is a good position to start from. But yes, you know, this would be an interim policy. There may well be challenges. Once we get to the point where we've got, when we take this through examination and through viability testing, and we ultimately get that adopted within the plan, then we've got much more certainty about its status as a policy. At the moment, there's that sort of in between, but it's one we think is an appropriate tool to use going forward in the next couple of years or so.
Councillor Cameron, question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sorry, it is going to be a thing back to Rob, I think. It is a question about the rural safeguards from the right to buy. If I've understood this, is this us now being sort of put on parity with the Peak Park? So does this situation exist at the minute in the Peak Park?
Councillor, yeah, Chair, the Rural Area Designation, Section 157 of the Housing Act, already does apply within the national park. So the safeguards, as far as I'm aware, would exist within the national park as it stands at the moment.
And have you ever used them then? Because I'm just thinking of several, certainly in my ward, of houses that are now holiday homes that were council homes. And I'm just thinking, once that got to the point they were put on the market, did the authority ever use this actual right that you've got in here to do a preemptive right to buy back? Has it ever tried to do that, to stop ex-council houses ending up as holiday homes?
That's a good question. We've not had that ability before. The cost, as you'll know in the villages, is substantial, and we've not exercised that right to buy back before. I don't think the housing associations have either.
Sorry, could I just follow up? Is it dependent on cost then? You don't get to set the price. You have to, if you don't going to exercise your right to buy, then the authority's got to buy back at the market price.
Yes, and my understanding is just like selling any other property, there may be a slight reduction in the overall price due to the Derbyshire, what's called the Derbyshire clause, but the open market values lift the prices of all properties, not just those that perform a right to buys.
So are we confident we're going to be able to actually, well, we've put this safeguard on highs, because I'm just conscious, obviously, the fact we're putting this on the small villages, aren't we, which I imagine, even outside the Peak Park, are they going to be the properties that probably attract the higher prices? Therefore, are you just going to be in exactly the same place there? Although you've got this right, it'll be difficult to actually exercise it, because they'll be pricey properties.
Yeah, so as we set out in paragraph 2.1, section 2, section 1, we have referred to the fact that it is difficult to do. I won't pull any punches there. It's not a... in the last report we just discussed, we were talking about the price point we're able to buy property at. These will often sell at a much higher price than we're able to make work from a viability perspective.
Thank you. Any more questions? I'd like to move to debate. Can I find a proposer for this? Councillor Atkins.
Chair, yes, I'd like to propose a recommendation to set out in the report.
Does that find a seconder, please? Councillor Salt.
Thank you, Chair. I read it with interest, and when I first read it, I have to admit that my scepticism was a little bit the same as Councillor Hughes on the viability of lowering this number, when outwardly sometimes it looks like the numbers we've got don't always work and we don't always make them work. But I can only see it as a positive, really. I can think of a development on Act Lane, which I'm sure was 9 units. And there were big units, but probably not a big enough site to take them to task over. And that would have opened up this opportunity for monies from it. So I can't really see a downside to it. So I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Is there anybody else who wishes to make any more comments? Councillor Buckler.
Yeah, as the representative of Northwood and Tinkersley, I'm delighted to see this. It's Northwood and Tinkersley, obviously, from a community size point of view and a community density point of view, it would have been excluded from this rural designation. But from the size of the community, this will make a big difference to the potential for communities like that to get more to get opportunities for affordable housing. So I'm really pleased that it's been that Mike's managed to get this in the way that he's managed to do it.
Thank you. Anybody else wishing to make any comments? Councillor Slack.
Mike asked for examples where things have gone wrong in the planning policy. The first development at Corner Quarry were the flats. There was no affordable housing at all on them. I wouldn't vote for it because there were no affordable housing on those. And they were built on solid ground, quite easy, and they got the flats up and they're a tremendous price now. So we did lose out badly there on getting any affordable housing, which we should have got from them flats, because that area corner is the better part to build on. But we lost, and that's it, and disappointed.
Anybody else wishing to make any comments upon this? And it has been proposed and seconded to go to the vote. All those in favour, please show. Against? Abstentions? That's it. That's carried. Thank you very much. Do we need to? Okay. Okay. Before we start this next item, can I have somebody to propose that we extend the meeting till the items on the agenda have been finished? Councillor Swindle, seconded. Seconded, Councillor Flitter. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to item 16, review of member allowance scheme. I believe Dr. Declan Hall, is that? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Also, Councillor, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me here tonight to present the main findings of the report and go through the main recommendations and take any questions you may have. I want to emphasise that this report and its recommendations are very much the consensus of the whole independent remuneration panel. I'd like the opportunity to note and thank the work of fellow IRP colleagues who put an awful lot of work in this. And also, while I'm here, I'd like to thank the councillors who engaged with the review. There was a high level of engagement with the review. Without you, we couldn't have done it. Now, before I actually go on to go through the main headlines of the report, I know Jason actually pointed out that there was a typo in the latest version of the report we sent, I think, which is alerted you to. I also took the opportunity to go through it with a fine-tooth comb this afternoon before I came up here. I got called from Coventry. And I've identified 5 more typos. So, Chair, for the record, I just really want to actually note them so that they're all noted. The first typo is in paragraph 28 on the second line, where it says hourly median earnings. It should say daily median earnings. On the second typo, on paragraph 39, where it says the leader currently gets 6,942 plus 2,312 per group member, on the third line, of course it should read 6,942 plus 231 per group member, as if it was getting 2,000 odd per group member. On paragraph 66, on the SRA for recommendations for the 2 chairs of the policy committees and the chair of the council, where it reads currently the recommendation 4628, of course it should read 4687. On paragraph 130, where it says was raised strongly, of course it should say was not raised strongly, so as to be a not between the was and raised. And of course, in Appendix 2, under written submissions, where it says Councillor Greatrix is a Labour councillor, where it says councillor we've actually listed down them down as a Conservative councillor, when in fact they are a Labour councillor. Yeah, I was reassigning political balance of the council. Listen, apologies for that. It inevitably happens. There will probably be more typos as well. I take responsibility as the lead author of this. Right, first of all, now, hopefully this should take no more than about 7 minutes. First of all, a couple of observations that the panel made during, at the conclusion of the review. That the allowances scheme did require revision, and which was supported in the representation we received. They've been frozen since 2021. The BA had not been reviewed since 2000. The basic allowance, that is, had not been reviewed since 2015, and even then it was most cursory review. And the framework was set as far as we could ascertain. It was all lost in the mist of time. But as far as we could ascertain, it was set in 2008. It's not been revisited since then. The second point we wanted to make was on the function of an allowances scheme, because there was some representation, not a lot, but there was some representation received about it should be able to attract a wider range of people to become a councillor. But allowances are an enabler rather than an attractor. Looking around me here, I'm deducing that there's a number of you who wouldn't, the remuneration is neither here nor there. You could be a councillor where there's any remuneration, or if there was no remuneration, because you have the time and other means of support to be a councillor. We are not necessarily making recommendations for those councillors. We are making recommendations for those councillors where the remuneration enables them to be a councillor. I was looking at the original policy intent behind allowances schemes going back to the 1998 white paper, Local Leadership, Local Choice, and it says, allowances schemes should seek as far as possible to reduce financial disincentives. Therefore, it's an enabler, and that's what we were seeking to do. And again, the representation, anecdotal evidence we received, was that the allowances have probably reached a level where they weren't fulfilling the function of enabling wider range of people to stand as councillors. Now, bearing that in mind, also one of the key things that came through in the representation is that we had to be cognizant of the current economic context. There's no point in us making recommendations which bear no relationship to economic reality. Because otherwise we'd be making recommendations in the abstract, you'd vote them down, and we wouldn't be moving any forward at all. So we have bore that in mind. We sought to seek a balance between making recommendations which are fair and robust while keeping an eye on the economic context. And we note that the recommendations only result in an increase on the current spend of allowances of 1,588. And that's more than accounted for by the addition of the 2 additional SRAs. If we weren't having additional SRAs, we'd actually be less than the current spend. Now, just looking at the basic allowance, that's the most important thing. And we know there's going to be a decrease in councillors from, 39 to 34, which will result in an increase in the workload. And one of the things we did do was take the current spend on basic allowance, 39 councillors, take that total and divide it by the new number of councillors, 34, and put us up to about 5,350. But we didn't think the relationship was that linear. But what we did do was recalibrate the basic allowance in line with the advice set out in the statutory guidance. 3 variables to consider. Time to be a councillor, and we adopted 14 hours a week or 91 days a year to be a councillor. Now, I recognise that some of you, as a backbencher, might actually be putting in more than 91 days per year, but that's because you've got the capacity. We're looking at the time required. The statutory guidance also requires that the voluntary element must be built into the basic allowance. Not all your time is remunerated. So we discounted 40% of the assessed time, required time input, as what's called a public service discount. It's often conceptualised as the element that you working with local ward issues, communities, constituent issues, outside the formal work of the council. Interestingly, if you were at the county council, that public service discount would probably would actually be roughly about 1/3. But they don't have such a close relationship with the constituents as a county councillor as you do at a district council. Then we've got to look at the rate of remuneration. What's a councillor's time worth? And what we've adopted was £103 per day, which is the median earnings of all employees in the district, excluding overtime. So it's relating your basic allowance. It's based upon a rate remuneration. It's based upon the median earnings of those you represent, thus making it robust. You plug that into a formula, time minus public service discount, times the rate of remuneration, and that got us to £5,150, which in the end we ended up recommending. It's because it recognised the weight of the representation that we received, and it's still below the average basic allowance that we looked at in the benchmark authorities, which are the other district councils in Derbyshire and your SITFA and your neighbours. I can't remember whether we used 8 or 6, but you're the SITFA and your neighbours. The other point I want to look at on the main SRA look at here is the leaders SRA. I mean, currently it's based upon a hybrid approach of fixed amount plus so much per group member. We decided to fix it. No other scheme actually does that. You know, the leader's going to be the leader, and the leader is the leader is the leader. And most of the vast majority of the remuneration is actually for the leader's responsibility as opposed to group responsibility. Inevitably, the leader is going to be the leader of the largest group. So whether the group's 21 or 22 or 25, it's not going to really make much difference. And we set it in accordance with the statutory guidance, which is called the factor approach. It is a factor of the basic allowance. We noted that in the benchmarking group, on average, the leader's SRA was 3 times that of the average basic allowance. We didn't go for that higher factor because most of the leaders in the benchmarking group had executive powers, and that's not the model you operate here. So we simply adopted 2.6 times the basic allowance to arrive at the recommended leaders again. Again, we recognise that's below the benchmark mean, but again, we were happy with below the benchmark mean because the leader here doesn't have executive powers, which they do in most of the other benchmark councils. Not all of them, but most of them. On other SRAs, we set in accordance with what's called, again with the statutory guidance, what's called the pro rata approach. By definition, the leader's 100%. Nobody's going to have greater workload and responsibility than the leader, and all of the SRAs were set as a proportion thereof. And the logic is laid out in the report, but again, I want to point out, all the SRAs that we recommended are either in line or below, in fact, most of them below the average in the benchmark councils. An unusual recommendation that we made, and we made this in response to the representation received, you don't see this very often, is that we recommend that an SRA be paid for vice chair, the chair's SRA be paid to the vice chair of a committee if that vice chair has chaired a meeting for more than 3 months. But again, that was based upon representation we received. Again, we kept the one SRA rule. That's almost universal in local government. Almost, there are one or two authorities, but they don't do that. Dependent carers allowance, we kept. There was a great deal of support for that, even though it was rarely claimed, but I think it was the principle it underlined. And we decided to differentiate between the two types of care. The child care can claim at one rate. If you're elderly or disabled care, then it's a higher rate. Subsistence, we kept the rates, but we withdrew the right for members to claim subsistence for attending approved duties within the district. From what we could ascertain, it was rarely, if ever, claimed, but we've done away with it. It's an outdated provision that relates back to the time when councillors really weren't getting any decent remuneration. Travel, we recommend, particularly on the mileage, we recommended the full HMRC rates because they're not actually in the scheme. And we clarified that councillors, to future-proof the scheme, councillors claiming by travel by hybrid or electric vehicles, they can also claim the 45p a mile because that's allowable. We removed the 3 mile threshold before you can claim a mileage allowance. Couldn't really see the logic of that. And we clarified that members can claim mileage for attending parish council meetings because it wasn't clear in the scheme that could be done. I think it was actually members put a claim in, I think it was being paid. But for clarification purposes, we did that. But also we recommended for clarification purposes that councillors should not be able to claim mileage for dealing with constituent issues. And the reason why is you can, the principle being, for claiming mileage allowance, you should be able to verify that you undertook the duty. You can verify that member actually attended a parish council meeting by looking at their attendance records. We can't. It's good practice in the public sector that any claim that is claimable, that the duty can be proved that was undertaken. And then under any other business, and this was raised, not strongly raised, but it was raised, the issue of member performance. There was a sense of inequity that, as a member, I'm attending all the meetings I'm supposed to be doing, but member X or member Y may not be attending the meetings that they're supposed to attend, and they're still getting paid the same as me. Well, interestingly, there's one I noticed on the next item. You're talking about the statutory vacation of office by a councillor who's not attended who fell foul of the 6 months rule. Of course, that is actually one way of dealing with it. We as a panel have to, and you as a council, have to pay an equal basic allowance paid equally to all. The regulations say a basic allowance shall be paid equally to all council. We didn't think it was a big issue, but ultimately it's a political issue for the council to resolve. There's not a lot as a panel that we can deal with it. Finally, there's the issue of indexation. Historically, up until 2021, the main allowances have been indexed to, it's called the NJC index, National Joint Council. Whatever officers get in terms of an annual percentage pay increase, apply the same to members. We carried on with that recommendation. It's the almost universal index that councils adopt across English local government. But I just want to make just a note on this, that if you do not adopt the index of allowances, which is applied automatically without reference to the council for 4 years, you can't alter the allowances at all without further reference to your independent remuneration panel. But if you do have an index in place, you're under no compulsion on any particular year to implement it. You can decide not to implement it in any one particular year. But if you don't have it in place, you can't alter your allowances at all without first getting a view of the independent remuneration panel. I'd just like to say that. So in conclusion, I would like to, the IRP feels that the recommendations in this report are robust, evidence-based, fair, and still represent value for money. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Hughes, question. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. On that last point about being fair and equitable, the allowance, up until now we've been indexed with councillors' remuneration has been indexed with council employees. The proposal ties it to the average income in the median income in the district, and the consequence is an increase of a little over 5% over what would otherwise be applied. So instead of £4,899, the remuneration will be about 5,150. So, and that's 5%. So that sort of suggests we're getting a bigger increment than our officers. And as far as I feel that I'm concerned about that because of fairness, and we're all in this together, and I'm a bit embarrassed by that. So I'd be interested in your comments on that, Dr. Hall. And the second area then is paragraph 103, the independent persons element, and you're proposing the £300 per annum remuneration for the independent persons, and you base that on the number of complaints that are covered, and the assumption is that £20 per complaint or thereabouts, plus £100 for appearing at a tribunal. As other officers will know, as other councillors will know, I've been subject to a complaint, and to be honest, I wasn't satisfied with the independent persons review of or contribution to that. I thought it was not very substantial, and in fact went against what the legal team here had suggested, and I felt the legal team was correct. Nevertheless, having seen that they would get £20 for that, I felt that was not enough, and perhaps they would have done a more thorough job if they'd received a higher remuneration. And then the other area where I think that a higher remuneration might have been called for was when we were discussing the Black Boys head in Ashbourne, where again the contribution from the independent person who attended the council and would therefore get his amount was not up to standard. And is that because they weren't being paid enough to do the necessary due diligence on the report that was produced? So I feel that we should be paying our independent persons more, and we should be paying the councillors slightly less. I'd be very grateful for your opinion on that, Dr. Hall.
Well, first of all, going back to the basic allowance, yeah, I do know that if the basic allowance had continued to have been carried on been indexed since 2021, that it would be 4,899. You're right. But I wouldn't confuse how we've arrived at the recalibrated allowance based on the indexation going forward, that the two separate issues. But regardless of what we know, we did note that in the report, it would be, if indexation carried on, it would be 4,899. But regardless, the panel still felt the basic allowance was too low, particularly taking into account the reduction in the number of councillors. There's going to be more workload for councillors. We're still not recommending a basic allowance, which would be total spent on basic allowance now, divided by 34 councillors next year. That would actually come out to 5,350. We're going below that. So, too low. The recommended basic allowance results on a savings on the current spend on basic allowance, taking into account reduction in councillors. Benchmarking shows that it's too low, and there's a general feeling in the representation that the panel received, not universal, but the general view put to it was, yeah, it did require revision, and it hasn't been looked at for so long that it's lagging behind its peers. That's where we're coming from on the basic allowance. In terms of the independent person, we actually had the opportunity to interview one of the independent persons, and I don't want to. I don't really want to. I never try and identify people who spoke to the independent person, but we received no evidence that the current annual total required revision. I think what was put to us was that the way it's actually done probably doesn't recognise the wider work of an independent person where they're contacted on an informal basis and it's not dealt with on an informal complaint. So we're hoping by going from the flat rate approach, they'd be more inclined to put more into the role when contacted on an informal basis. But again, we didn't receive any evidence that the remuneration of the independent person required revision. So but that's why we've based it upon average number of meetings and complaints over the past year or couple of years.
Thank you. Councillor Swindle.
Chair, it's not a question. Is that... Can I fire away?
It's a comment of what you've noted then,
No, it's a general comment on the subject. Is that okay?
Can I come back to you?
Yeah,
then
sure,
on that one?
yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Allison.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a point of clarification. It's probably more aimed at James, actually, than the presenter of the report. In paragraph 57, it says in the report that the Planning Committee exercises quasi-judicial functions. And I know we've had this discussion before, and I'm sure you've told us in our training on planning about that, because my understanding is, and it's the LGA definition as well, is that it's an administrative function, not quasi-judicial. And the only quasi-judicial committee that we have on this council is the licensing committee. Thank you.
I refer that to the monitoring officer for clarification.
Yeah, through you, Chair, that's correct. It is an administrative committee. Yeah, planning committee, as members are aware, you make decisions on matters that are put in front of you, you assess the merits of it, but it's not done on a quasi-judicial basis like licensing would be. But there's often a similarity struck between the two because of the regulatory nature of the functions.
You're happy with that?
That's news to me, and I've been doing this for 30 years.
Councillor Campbell, question.
Okay. Well, thanks. Given that, then, are you still happy with the disparity between what the chairman of planning is paid and the chairman of licensing and appeals, considering licensing appeals is quasi-judicial and the planning is purely administrative?
The recommendation for the SRA for the chair of planning is
5,000, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nearly double what the licensing, i.e. the person who does a quasi-judicial job gets half what someone who just agrees with the planning officers every time.
But you're looking at licensing, a lot of the decisions of licensing are actually made. Let me just check it here. Well, actually, if you look at what the panel, the recommendations or the deliberations on the panel, we actually did consider setting it higher.
But as we know now, you were under the impression that that was a quasi-judicial. You just said now that this is new to you in 30 years. So presumably all the discussions took place on the idea that planning was quasi-judicial.
Well,
Dr. Hall, I'll just bring in our monitoring officer again to help if that's all right.
Yeah.
I think the merits of quasi-judicial v administrative, there's the financial values that the panel may have sought to attach to it. It's not undermined by the difference.
Okay. In your opinion, can you provide then the justification of why a chairman of planning is worth twice the chairman of licensing and appeals?
Well, we looked at the benchmarking, And we saw that in the vast majority, in every council out there, the highest paid chair is always the chair of planning, on the basis that while it may not be legally quasi-judicial, though I was told it was elsewhere, that they are making decisions which are regulatory. They are making regulatory decisions, and I think that's the key. But they meet more often than licensing, and a lot of the work of licensing is actually done through the subcommittees rather than the full committee. And when we looked at the SRA for the chair of licensing, we did consider, I'll tell you about some of the deliberations, we did consider setting it higher than we've actually finally recommended. But we looked at, well, if you set it at 20%, we effectively doubled the SRA, and then we thought, well, going higher than doubling would be difficult to justify. You know, proportionately, the chair licensing gets the biggest raise of anybody in the council, although you might not agree with the actual level set.
I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just wondering, are you now with the information? Are you still happy? But from obviously what you're saying, you are still happy for the chair. You're planning to be paid a lot more. Did you consider the idea? One thing I've got to admit, I've got to ask you about. I've never understood, particularly why and I think we need to ask questions about this. Looking at the totals, like the SRAs, are nearly a quarter of the total of spend on members. That's quite a high proportion, isn't it?
What you're saying of the total spend?
On the total spend is 229, and we spend 54 on SRAs.
Well,
that's actually, nearly a quarter, isn't it?
Well,
it's around a quarter.
I've been doing this long enough.
Yeah.
And let me just have a look at the figures on the recommendations. Let me see. A normal distribution. So what we've got here is for every £1 spent on SRAs, we're roughly getting about £3, just under £3 spent on SRAs. So for every £1, for every £1 spent, the ratio is £3 basic.
But the total's about a quarter, isn't it? Can we agree that?
The normal ratio is 2 to 1. So what I'm saying here, compared to elsewhere, the SRA's level is actually low.
Yeah.
Normally, if you go, I read annual statutory publications of allowances from councils as for a living, and normally for every £2 spent on the basic, you've got £1 spent on SRAs. For here, it's about 3 to 1.
Yeah.
So actually, I'll disagree with you.
Well, what do you disagree? All I stated was that it was a quarter.
Councillor Gamble, Councillor Gamble, that's, I think, but I think you've made your point in what you're trying to say, and I do believe Dr. Hall has given you his fair analysis back. So
could I just ask one more thing? Just whether
a question other than what you've already asked.
Yeah, different question really.
Right.
I'm just wondering whether you considered what the value is, considering sort of how much we do pay out in SRAs, what the value is in paying vice chairs. Because some of those presumably will get that remuneration all year and potentially never chair a meeting. And I just wondered if you thought about whether actually having an allowance for a chair and to actually award that compared to what meetings people actually do chair. I just wondered if you'd considered that.
We did consider whether there's a case to maintain the SRAs for vice chairs. On balance, we thought there was, on the grounds that their role is not confined to actually standing in as and when required. There's a general expectation that they attend briefing meetings with their chairs, they're in regular contact with the chairs, discuss agendas with their chairs, and support their chairs generally during the meeting. And then we looked at the level of remuneration for vice chairs, and we thought, well, it's actually not an awful lot in the big scheme of things, so we kept it.
Thank you. Councillor Tony Morley, question.
Thank you, Chair. It's a little side issue, and I get the sensitivity about getting a rise in remuneration at this particular time, so I'm going to set them to one side. This is a very specific issue about travel to parish council meetings. Now, you do talk very quickly, and I was listening very carefully, but are you recommending that we claim mileage allowance to parish council meetings? And the reason I say that is some of us have rural wards where we have 5 parishes and we have 5 parish meetings, so we're there regularly. Are you recommending that we charge mileage for those meetings?
What we are recommending is councillors are able to claim mileage for attending parish council meetings within their ward if they so wish. You're not under any obligation to do so, but yes, we're clarifying the scheme that you can do it.
Thank you.
Now,
That's fine.
now, again, I just want to put history in this. If you go back historically...
Honestly, you don't need to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Burford's, Mrs. Burford.
Yeah, thank you,
Question.
Chair. I'm not suggesting for one moment that those of us who are on planning committees get extra remuneration for that, because as far as I'm concerned, as a member of the planning committee, that is the most interesting committee that we have. But you did recognise that the role of chair and vice chair of the planning committee is a larger role than chairing the other policy committees. And one of the reasons for that, well, amongst the other reasons for that, is that we meet once a month. Can I ask whether you did give any, but there's no recognition at all about those of us, anybody who is on the planning committee who attends every month, plus site visits?
We gave it the briefest consideration, but quickly dropped it on the basis that there's work that other members do on other committees which is not necessarily recognised through attendance. For instance, you can be on licensing subcommittees quite regularly, which you don't get, and there could be informal working groups and panels which councillors can be on. And it's not normal to recommend additional remuneration from members of the planning committee. We note that in the benchmarking. And finally, we didn't receive any representation, any argument that members of planning should get extra remuneration.
Thank you for that. I think questions have been exhausted. So I'd like a proposer for Councillor Purdy.
Well, I think we could debate this all night and all week probably, because there's always different views and opinions on this. The fact is that the chair of planning and planning committee members do put more hours in than other committee members, and you have a choice whether you go on a committee or not when you first start. Approached by some members are concerned about the sensitivity of this and what the public would say if we accepted a rise. I've got no vested interest in this, but my personal view is that we ought to accept the recommendations of Dr. Hall and his hard-working team, and personally I think probably to defer acceptance of the lift in remuneration probably to April 24. That's just my humble view. I put that forward as a recommendation in the motion, Chair. If anybody's happy to support that, or we'll be here all night arguing differently.
Councillor Gamble, do you want to support that?
Yeah, I would support putting it forward at least to 2024. I think in the current cost of living, I think it's a bit difficult to justify now. Are we able to say that actually what we think rather than asking questions?
Yeah, I'm not asking a question now. Are you actually, you can speak as regards a second.
I still think that the proportion of giving her SRIs is over compared to what is actually put in. I think there's a lot of chairing which is actually done very minimally, where a lot of asking officers what to do all the time. I don't see the value in giving a quarter of this to SRIs. So I'd just like to put a record that I chaired some maybe, and I do think that the chairman of planning is an excessive. For someone who does nothing but always agree with officer and make penis jokes on site visits.
Yeah, point of order.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like point of order.
Point,
No,
yeah.
nobody
But-
makes comments like that, I'm afraid. Redact it.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so with that in mind of what you've just made a comment of, I don't believe then that you are actually seconding the motion that Councillor Purdy's put in. So I'm going to look to a seconder elsewhere. Councillor Donnelly.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Councillor Swindell, I'm coming back to you as comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to say it's getting late, so I'm going to do something really controversial to wake you all up. But I think that did it. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I am going to say something that's controversial. For any members of the public listening or listening later, it isn't going to be popular with the public because advocating an increase in the basic allowance for the role of a councillor isn't something that is popular with the public. They see us all as grabbing money and doing very little. And I'm going to make all the rules of politics, and on this subject, admit that I've probably been wrong for the past 14 years. And I apologise to the late Councillor Lewis Rose, because we used to spar over this issue all the time, where I would always say there's an economic crisis, there's hardship in the communities, and we shouldn't be voting for a pay rise, we should set an example. After 14 years, I've realised that there's always going to be an economic crisis, there's always going to be hardship, and nothing seems to change whatever government gets in, and so on. But the point I want to make is my personal circumstances have changed. I'm a father now. I've got more bills to pay at home, and so on. And because of that, that's one reason why I won't be coming back to the council standing for re-election and hoping to come back to the council. It's not something I want to do. It's something that, being a councillor, is something I will miss. My point is that I am standing down for personal reasons. I want to spend more time with my family. I'm also having to focus more on paid work, employment, because the cost of living's gone up. I'm now a clerk to 2 parish councils as well, because it pays more for the work that we do. And as a councillor, I can realistically, some weeks, put in, as a basic allowance councillor, 30 hours. That's on top of working 6 days with earlies, overtime, 2 clerk jobs, trying to be a dad. And it can be very hard work. Fair enough. Some weeks in the summer, I don't hear from anybody because everybody's outside enjoying themselves and not complaining. During the COVID and the bin situation, it was even more. It was, and to coin the now gone New Zealand Prime Minister, there's just nothing left in the tank. Now, the point I'm getting at is, I've said all these years that being a councillor should be something that you do out of the goodness of your heart and for your communities. And yes, there is an element of that. But if we want to, and this comes back to Dr. Hall's point about the difference between an enabler and an attractor. Yes, it enables people to be a councillor, but we need to attract people to be a councillor. And we need to attract the right people. And it's no offence to any individual councillor in here. To attract councillors who are younger, people who work, people who have families, so we get a diverse range of councillors, people in the real world, and councillors who are retired and have more time to do it. We need a greater diversity in here. And the only way you're going to do that is by paying a wage that people can live on. Because roughly what do I take home from the council here a month? £300. I couldn't survive on that, but I am putting in almost as much time as a full-time job. And it's not a direct attack on this council or the issues that have been raised or the panel that have put forward the recommendations. I just needed to put forward the view that, some councillors are worth £2,000 a month. some are worth £20 a month. And you're always going to get that. But if you want to attract people with expertise, people with commitment and dedication, and will put the work in and really support their communities, then it's probably more of a shout to central government, but councillors need to be paid a heck of a lot more. That's really all I've got to say on it, Chair, but I'm not coming back because I'm not paid enough, but it would obviously help a little bit and hopefully attract better candidates at elections with the expertise and the dedication we need. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Sweeney. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think Councillor Swindle's covered quite a bit that I was going to mention. We've got an election looming, and I think this council needs to attract the younger generation to become councillors. And I think one way is to make the position more attractive by offering a reasonable remuneration. We need some younger blood in this chamber, and a decent basic allowance may go some way to promote that. Now's the chance before this election, not part way into a new term. We need to do it now. But I think the majority of members here tonight don't really need an increase and could well afford to donate any extra cash to a charity that helps struggling families in their areas with the cost of living. And I think that would be a positive action by a councillor. So, Chair, I'm sorry, I'm not in favour of the deferral as mentioned by Councillor Purdy. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Morley.
Yeah, no, thank you. There was a point of clarification. Was the recommendation to accept this, but sit on it for a year?
Yes.
Right, thank you. We're supporting that.
Thank you. Is there anybody else wishing to? Councillor Flitter.
Yeah, again, I wasn't going to speak on this item, Chair, because I think to say that some people can afford this and sit on it and give money to charity is missing the point. The point is that I sat here many moons ago with my predecessor, and I vehemently disagreed with him because we still don't take the minimum wage home. And it is a job, it's a task in some respects, but we do it because we want to represent the people of Derbyshire Dales. And it does leave certain people and some people in financial difficulty, even on this council. But we do it out of the love of our heart, but we shouldn't be penalised for that at all. And I think that, you know, both Councillor Swindle and Councillor Elliott have made a good point. We're never going to attract the right people into the local government unless we pay the going rate. And we've just had a panel to sit down and do this independently with the knowledge of over 30 years of doing this work. Not to support the recommendations is a bit pointless of getting these people to do the work. I'm certainly not going to support a deferment because I want to see fresh faces. I'm certainly going to try to get re-elected again, and I want to see faces on this council that have got expertise, that are willing to share the workload and work together into a vibrant council. So I shall be voting for the original recommendation.
Councillor Hobson.
I accept everything that my colleagues have said, but one thing I do feel with this council, we've been here since 6 o'clock tonight. If we looked at the organisation of the minutes, the amount of meetings we have, the time of day we have them, and actually got on and did the work more quickly, I think it's more than about money for people who are working shifts, have to get up in the morning. It's not just about the money. I feel as personally, we're all arguing around the table, but our residents are going to be seeing council tax, cost of living increase, and I think because they don't care whether you work 2 hours or 20 hours a week, whatever, they don't want to see it happen, and I would support a deferral.
Councillor Slack.
Thank you, Chair. I disagree. I think the councillors put an enormous lot of work in. I mean, I'm on 4 different working groups, and I'm only a basic backbench councillor. And, you know, it's wrong. Councillor is right. You won't attract the right people unless we pay the proper going rate, really. So I won't be supporting Councillor Purdy's view. Thank you.
Okay, so everybody's speaking on that. So the proposal by Councillor Purdy is we take the recommendations set out, but with the implementation that it doesn't start until 2024 year. Have I got that right, Councillor? April 2024. Thank you. So, all those in favour of that recommendation, or please show hands.
Keep them up for a while, please. Okay,
Against?
Okay, abstentions.
Abstentions.
So that's lost.
So that motion has been lost. So do I have a proposer for the actual recommendations as sits on the paper? Councillor Burford, you propose that. Councillor Swindle, you second it? Go to the vote. All those in favour, please show.
Okay, against.
Against? And abstentions?
Carried.
So that motion has been carried. Thank you, Dr. Hall. Finally, moving on to item 17. James, I'll bring you in as regards to vacant office.
Thank you, Chair. Members, this report is just for information. I know we said we wouldn't take information reports, but this one does have to come to you. And it's just to note the statutory vacation of office by former Councillor Claire Raw, following her absence from meetings of the Council or its committees for a period of 6 months. As you only have to note the report, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Can I have a proposer for the noting of this report? Councillor Buttle.
I'll second it, Chair.
Councillor Atkins, second it. All those in favour, please show. Against? Abstentions? That's it. With that, I'd like to close the meeting at 21:10.